Welcome. I'm Professor Jennifer DeVere Brody, the Faculty Director of Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, which is one of the sponsors of this special program. The other sponsors are the McCory Family Center for Ethics and Society, the Stanford Basic Income Lab, and the Stanford Center for Racial Justice in the Law School. I want to thank Joan Barry and everyone here, especially Pam Goodman, for their help in organizing this event, both on camera and behind the scenes. I also want to point out that Professor Rick Banks is with us, and he'll be serving as tonight's interlocutor. It's really a treat for me to have my former colleagues, Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, here. They're going to speak with you for about 20 minutes before Rick joins them for conversation, and then we'll open up discussion, and please use the Q&A function. I so enjoyed working with both Sandy and Kirsten when we all taught in the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. So what we're going to do next is have a land acknowledgement, and then we're going to turn it over to a CCSRE graduate fellow and graduate student in the School of Education in the Race and Inequality and Language format, which is Alex Avila Orfinides. And he'll be introducing our esteemed guests. We're all going to be talking about From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, which came out in 2020, that auspicious year, from the University of North Carolina Press, and immediately garnered many awards, including the inaugural 2021 Book Prize from the Association of African American Life and History. So again, welcome, and we'll have the land acknowledgement and then get to the meat of the discussion. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Stanford sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe,
who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was, and continues to be, of great importance to Native people.
We recognize that every member of the community has benefited
and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land.
Consistent with our values of community and diversity,
we have a responsibility
to
acknowledge and make visible
the university's relationship
to Native people.
Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's truly an honor and a privilege to introduce this event's discussants. Welcome again to Resurrecting the Promise of 40 Acres. As the country transitions to a new administration and as the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacts Black communities, today's discussion of the Black-white wealth gap and reparations remains of the utmost importance. Today's event allows us to engage with reparations as a feasible program meant to erase the Black-white wealth gap and to fulfill a long unfulfilled promise. We are pleased to welcome renowned scholars Dr. William A. Darity and Kirsten Mullen, authors of the award-winning book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. After their presentation, our discussants will be joined in conversation by Stanford Professor Ralph Richard Banks. Following that, we'll open up for questions from today's guests. Some brief background on today's speakers. Dr. Darity is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class, ethnicity, stratification, economics, schooling, and the racial achievement gap, north-south theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market outcomes, and economics of reparations. Kirsten Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Ajayi Bond concept development team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she's trained students to research and record the state's African American music heritage. Today's conversation will be moderated by Professor Ralph Richard Banks. Professor Banks is the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. His writings have appeared in a wide range of popular and scholarly publications, including the Stanford Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the New York Times, and the LA Times. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having us, giving us the opportunity to talk to you about our work and From Here to Equality, reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to see Jennifer Brody again and to have Rick Banks as our interlocutor this evening. We also had the opportunity to meet with a class of both graduate and undergraduate students earlier today. So we hope we don't duplicate what we said to them. But we would like to begin by discussing the research that's associated with our book, and in particular with our definition of reparations. And I'm going to ask if Kirsten will start with that.
So basically, we're going to talk about why the solution for the racial wealth gap must be reparations. So ARC, when we were conducting research for our recent publication, From Here to Equality, Sandy and I studied redress programs from around the world. After consulting several successful initiatives, national and international models for restitution, we crafted our own definition of reparations. For us, reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice, ARC. Acknowledgement requires good faith. So what are we talking about? This is a national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed. Acknowledgement is achieved when the perpetrator and the beneficiaries of the atrocity or atrocities recognize and publicly admit their culpability. Redress is the remedy, the making it right act or acts of restitution for the grand crime by the perpetrator. Typically, redress takes one of two forms, restitution or atonement. In this case, the goal would be to restore the formerly enslaved to a condition they enjoyed prior to their enslavement. This is not possible for several reasons. Those individuals are now deceased, and even if they were alive today, they would not have had the experience of a, quote, non-enslaved existence to which they could be restored. It is possible, however, to move their descendants toward a more equitable position had they not endured those injustices. We focus on restitution as the appropriate form of redress rather than atonement, because it is impossible to expect African Americans collectively to agree that sufficient steps had been taken to justify forgiveness. We have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that cannot be established for atonement. So what would restitution look like? True reparations would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. We're talking about compensating Black American descendants of US slavery for past repression and exploitation, while also dramatically decreasing the stubborn existing obstacles to full citizenship. True reparations would lead to a sharp and enduring reduction in racial disparities, especially the Black-white gulf in wealth, and a dramatic increase in Black well-being. Closure, perhaps the most controversial aspect of the reparations program we advocate, is the victim's agreement that the perpetrator has met the debt owed and no further claims made unless, and this is critical, unless there is a renewal of the harm or imposition of a new harm. Closure requires mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination towards Blacks. The project of reparations is one of huge challenges and great promise.
We'd like to emphasize that the case that we build for reparations in our book is not limited to slavery. In fact, we are very disturbed whenever we hear the phrase slavery reparations. We have in mind a case for reparations that's predicated on three phases of American history. The first, obviously, is slavery itself, but the second is nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States, accompanied by wave upon wave of white massacres that took place north and south, east and west. The most notorious of these probably is the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which was featured in the TV program Watchmen. But in our own state of North Carolina, there was a hugely vicious massacre that took place in 1898 in Wilmington. According to the classic phrase describing 1919, the Red Summer, that was presumably the bloodiest year of these massacres. And we estimate that there were upwards of 35 of these massacres that took place across the country in communities ranging from Washington, D.C., to Omaha, Nebraska, to Elaine, Arkansas, to Chicago, Illinois. In the process of these massacres occurring, Black lives were lost, but in addition, Black property was either destroyed or it was seized and appropriated by the white terrorists. In the aftermath of this period of time, the period that follows the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, we still have ongoing atrocities, mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, discrimination in labor, housing, and credit markets. And then most significant from our standpoint, the economic indicator that is the cumulative consequence of the cumulative intergenerational consequence of white supremacy, the enormous racial wealth gap in the United States. Wealth, which is the difference between what you own and what you owe, or the net value of your property, is perhaps the most important component of maintaining financial security and economic well-being in the United States. And the magnitude of this wealth gap between Blacks and whites is staggering. The average Black household has $840,000 less in net worth than the average white household. This is also a statistic that can be understood by thinking about the fact that Black Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2.5% of the nation's wealth. Under these circumstances, we argue in From Here to Equality that the primary objective of a reparations plan must include elimination of the racial wealth differential. And this is something that would be accomplished by an expenditure of somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion. Now, there's an important point that has to be made about the distinction between ending harms and compensating for the harms. And there's a quotation that we typically share from Malcolm X, which we think is illustrative of this distinction. And I think we talked about this earlier today. But the quotation reads as follows: "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't even begun to pull the knife out. They won't even admit the knife is there." And what I'd like to focus on is the distinction between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. And from our perspective, reparations constitutes healing the wound. But it's important to pull the knife out also. And so we need to end the conditions of structural racism, but reparations requires us to compensate for the effects of structural racism.
So we want to talk about two different types of misperceptions that, let's see, we're doing a piecemeal.
Let's talk about the two different types of misperceptions, and then we'll close with the piecemeal discussion.
Yeah, so two different types of misperceptions that we feel are largely responsible for, how we got to here, both our understanding of our history and our misunderstanding of our history. And so I want to talk first about, sort of start with the present and go backwards. So when you think about the culmination on January 6th of this year, at least 4 years of fevered lost cause machinations, this is a potent reminder that America's collective memory of our past is woefully deficient. It's not that our history has not been put down on paper. We simply have not been taught the whole account or how to make connections about how we got to here. One excellent source of eyewitness descriptions of what was happening on the ground in the period immediately after the Civil War, is the Congressional Klan hearings published in 1872. So 13 volumes of transcripts detailing dozens of deaths, injuries inflicted, and disappearances to individuals who advocated for Black male suffrage and for the rights of Black people to purchase property, to sit on juries, to negotiate contracts on their own behalf. Silencing people with opposing views was one of the Klan's goals. So dismemory is the term that I coined to describe the methodical work aimed at forgetting and distorting the nation's history, basically misinterpreting, misrepresenting the facts on the ground. Historian Eric Foner has written about how, when the Civil War ended, Jefferson Davis was, quote, deeply unpopular, unquote, and that he and Robert E. Lee were linked to Southern defeat. The war was followed by 7 mystic years of Reconstruction. This is a period when newly emancipated Blacks enjoyed citizenship rights and Black men co-governed with whites. Then, over the next 5 years, white allies withdrew from these partnerships and abandoned Blacks to face well-armed white mobs as white supremacy roared back across the North and the South. So Lee becomes a hero, and the Southern cause is viewed by many less as a battle waged by traitors and secessionists as by good men fighting for their way of life. Slavery, not just an essential ingredient in the Southern lifestyle, but the essential ingredient, is moved off stage, and authors begin to pen stories about honorable Southern gentlemen, men of character, and belles who were simultaneously steely and demure. So 2 interlocking myths that we frequently hear. One, only a small fraction of Southerners owned slaves, 3% or less. We've heard this many times. And the slave trade and ownership and management of coerced Black men, women, and children was confined to a small number of white people. So we provide the facts and from here to equality. And let's see here, I'm gonna read this, a quick section here from our chapter on who reaped the fruits of slavery. Let's see. So slavery and slaveholding were direct and intimate parts of the lives of many white Americans, particularly those in the Southern states that would form the Confederacy. Far from slave ownership being the purview of a tiny few, slaveholding families enjoyed a wider presence and prevalence than frequently is acknowledged. Among whites, particularly those in the South, slavery truly was a family affair on the eve of the Civil War. In 1860, at the national level, approximately 8% of all American families owned at least one slave. But this seemingly low aggregate national percentage was influenced heavily by the 21 non-Southern states where no families owned slaves during the last days of the antebellum period. By 1860, the Southern experience with slaveholding stood in marked contrast with the Northern pattern. So among the 11 states that seceded from the Union in 1861 to establish the Confederacy, and this would be Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, and Louisiana, registered at the lower end with at least 20% of white families owning slaves. So we're talking 20, 25, 26, 28, 28, and 29% respectively in those states. The remaining 5 states all registered proportions of 34% or higher, peaking at a staggering rate of 46 and 49% in South Carolina and Mississippi, respectively. A still more dramatic indicator of the scope of white engagement with slave ownership is the proportion of white people who were members of slaveholding families. While the national figure was 13%, in 1860, 1/4 of whites in Arkansas and Tennessee lived in families that owned at least one enslaved Black person. In Texas, Virginia, and North Carolina, at least 1/3 of whites lived in slave-owning families. This proportion rose well above 40% in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, cresting at a fantastic 56 and 57% in Mississippi and South Carolina, respectively. So slave owners and non-slave owners alike were intimately connected to the system. Its economic power was felt in the North and South and across the globe. So another myth that we hear often, Blacks may have had it bad, but so did white indentures. They were enslaved too. So turning again to From Here to Equality, we write, what do we write? Black people,
Let me see if I can.
here we go, overwhelmingly were the objects of enslavement. While there was an extended period of white immigrant indentured servitude during the colonial period, their numbers were dwarfed by coerced immigrants from the African continent. Even at the height of importation of white indentures, while 216,000 whites came to British North America as bonded laborers, 300,000 Africans were forcibly imported to the colonies. By the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the practice of white indentureship was in sharp decline. On the other hand, by 1790, there were close to 700,000 enslaved Blacks in the United States, a number that grew to 1 million by the start of the Civil War. Moreover, Black enslavement had a unique severity that obviates any equivalence that might be drawn to white indentured servitude. As historian Dominic Sandbrook observes, quote, "It was almost always much better to be a European servant than an African slave. Not only were servants transported in better conditions, they could also hope to be free men if they survived the term of service. Above all, they were white, which meant that they were automatically different from the West African slaves. As the servants would have pointed out, the racial codes of the American colonies were a lot more than window dressing. Calling them slaves might be a marketing ploy, but it stretches the meaning of slavery beyond its breaking point." We learned that the talented actor and country music star Reba McEntire is descended from white indenture George Brassfield, who arrived from England at the age of 9 to work in Virginia tobacco farms. He received a head right and purchases 300 acres of land and 1,600 pounds of tobacco in 1721. Less than a century later, his grandson, I believe he would have been McIntyre's 2 greats-grandfather, owns 1,615 acres of land, 10 Black bodies, and a tavern. Blacks were excluded from the head right program, and of course, until 1865, they and their children were slaves for life. The life and prospects of indentures was not the same as that of enslaved people.
The final thing that we'd like to do before we open the floor to conversation is to discuss the question of piecemeal reparations. And I want to emphasize that we believe that the bill must be paid by the United States government, the federal government. And this is because the United States government is the legal authority and the institution that sanctioned the 3 waves of atrocities, or the 3 periods of atrocity that we've talked about earlier, ranging from slavery itself to a century of legal segregation or American apartheid, into the present moment where we have ongoing discrimination and deprecation of Black lives. The federal government is the one that has the capacity to meet the bill, but it also has the responsibility to meet the bill. And this means in turn that state level or local attempts at racial atonement do not constitute true reparations. In fact, they should not be referred to as reparations. In many instances, local initiatives that parade under the label of reparations are not that at all. Local government actions called reparations, whether at the state or municipal level, frequently constitute an admission that the knife is there, followed by allocations for research or the construction of centers or statues, rather than compensatory payments to individual Black Americans. These types of steps to reverse an ongoing harm are desirable, but they do not effectively heal the wound produced by the harm. And usually they do not involve any compensatory payment. When they do, it's impossible for state and local governments to actually meet the bill for full compensation. Remember, we suggested that the bill for the reparations plan has to be somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $12 trillion at minimum. The total budgets for all state and local governments in the United States combined amounts to about $3.1 trillion. So even if all of those funds were devoted to a reparations project, and if they were, state and local governments could not perform any services whatsoever, we still would have a shortfall in a given year of the $7 trillion that's required to close the racial wealth differential. And so it's clear that the federal government is the institution that has the responsibility and has the capacity to meet the bill, and that's who the bill should be directed toward. Okay.
That's a lot. This is Rick Banks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Let me start by just saying thank you to all of the organizers. There's always a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that makes something seem very easy and seamless when it happens, but it doesn't become seamless by accident. So thank you to all the work that's going on behind the scenes to make that happen. Thank you especially to our honored speakers, Kirsten and Sandy. I cannot but help think back to a wonderful dinner that we had at our house, which I can say sparked conversations about reparations within our family that have continued on to now. And that this is a wonderful opportunity to pick up those conversations. This was years ago. I remember when we talked about this project, it was still in its infancy.
Right.
And we expressed, and myself as well, we expressed some skepticism about it for many different reasons. You all were undaunted or
foolish.
No, you were undaunted, and I can only say and cannot overstate how delighted, impressed, inspired that I am that you brought this project to fruition at this time in the way that you have, and even more so, frankly, that you've completed the book together. That is an extraordinary achievement and is really a sterling example in so many ways for so many of us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So as I said, this book has sparked lots of conversation and reflections and understandings that we need to grapple with. This function of the book actually resonates with me. Let me just add a bit of biography in because my wife, Jennifer, as you all know, we're from Cleveland, but our parents all come from Georgia and Alabama. And we know from our own family's experiences that the reign of racial terrorism was something that was more pervasive and more insidious than we have yet to recognize as a nation, and that we've never really grappled with. We also know that the slave past, as you mentioned in the book, is often denigrated or minimized as being so long ago. But in fact, in our case, my father knew slaves when he was young, and I'm sure that our grandparents knew people who had been born slaves as well. Yet there's been a silence about that past in an effort to try to consign it to the dustbin of history. So one of the powerful functions of this book, I think, is to really unsettle and move us beyond this denial that we seem to be locked in. So if you don't have this book, you should get it. If you haven't read it, you should read it. You will learn not only, as they say, about the period of slavery, but also about the period of racial terrorism that we sometimes forget followed slavery, and even more about contemporary times and the mechanisms of our current society, which entrench some of the inequalities that began in slavery. Okay, so questions. And I will say, I was skeptical of this project for many different ways, and I'm still skeptical as much as I love it. So let's start with one question that a lot of people might be thinking about, and I know certainly people were thinking about it when the Democratic candidates for president were talking about reparations during the primary season, and that's the issue of political feasibility. You propose in this book cash reparations with the big price tag, as you mentioned. Is the goal of this project really to move us toward cash reparations? Do you really think that's realistic? Or do you envision this as really a way to get people talking and to confront our history so that they can be motivated to take all sorts of initiatives to further racial justice? Which is it?
I think we're very ambitious. And we think that an apology and a conversation are important and vital, but not sufficient. And certainly in other cases of grievous injustice that have been addressed through redress initiatives, direct payments have been made to eligible recipients, whether it's the German government's payments to the victims of the Holocaust, or it's the United States government's payments to Japanese Americans who were subjected to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. So, from our perspective, it's essential that those kinds of payments be made, because what we're really after is establishing the full conditions for participatory citizenship on the part of Black Americans in the United States. And that requires a material foundation as well as a political one. And reparations would provide that material foundation that's required for full citizenship. So no, we're not just about trying to spark a conversation, although we think that that's important. And in fact, the conversation had already begun by the time our book came out, much to our surprise, because in the 2019 election cycle, there were credible politicians who were actually uttering the term reparations. Now, whether or not they were in favor of reparations is another issue, but we had never seen that kind of mention of the very idea until the 2019 election cycle. So in some ways, serendipitously, our book is riding a wave that had actually begun during 2019.
Okay, and why I want to have a few questions around this issue of cash payments, because you do make very clear that you're in support of cash payments.
No, we're in favor of direct payments. They could take the form of cash transfers, but in the final chapter, we also talk about the possibility of creating trust accounts or endowments as alternatives.
Yeah. Right. Okay, but why not, given the obvious political impediments to any sort of direct payment, why not promote reforms that would allow African Americans to accumulate wealth, such as really good schools, educational opportunities, job training, more vigorous enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. We live in a time when human capital is becoming ever more important. So why not double down on efforts to help African Americans develop the human capital that they could then transfer into the cold hard cash?
So we're not against any of those reforms. Bring them on.
Okay. And
also give us true reparations.
Okay.
I mean, they're two different things, right? And well, the other thing too is, this whole people say, oh, it's just a check, or let's get past the check part and talk about, structural racism. If Black families received $850,000, all of them who are, all the people who are eligible to receive that fund, that would be huge. And these individuals would be able to participate in American political life in a way that they cannot today. It's not that they're going to just take the money and just sit home and count it every day. My assumption is that they will be, actively involved in their communities in ways that they never dreamed they could. And so, they will be a part of this conversation, talking about what's happening with the police, talking about the schools. They will be able to move into a neighborhood that has higher amenities than the one that they're in presently if they choose to do so. We're talking about giving Black Americans the kind of access that white Americans have had, in this country for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the period immediately after the Civil War, a promise was made to the newly emancipated that was never fulfilled, and that was the promise of 40 acres land grants and restitution for their years of bondage. At the same time, 1.5 million white American families received 160-acre land grants under the terms of the Homestead Act in the Western Territories as the nation proceeded to complete its colonial settler project. And so we have a very sharp divergence in access to wealth from the beginning of the period of emancipation in the United States. And I would add that the types of reforms that you're describing, while vital and important to execute, could not lead to a closure of the racial wealth gap in the context of the existing level of resources that the Black community currently possesses. And one illustration is that's very important is this disturbing statistic that Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who never finished high school. And that's entirely attributable to differences in the capacity of previous generations to transfer resources to the current one. And so we need to change the conditions that establish opportunities for transferring wealth across generations.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I mean, one of the wonderful things you do that I really appreciated in the book was that you make very clear that while slavery was, of course, a monstrous institution, the end of slavery wasn't the end of the monstrous sort of acts that happened. And, some of us will know many of those. You talk about Rosewood, you talk about Tulsa, you talk about Wilmington, North Carolina. You talk about lots of stuff that people should know about but don't know about. And the Homestead Act is as well. It was a massive wealth transfer that, as you know, could have gone the other way, but it did not. And one of the tragedies is that, as you highlight, we have lots of points in history where we could have turned right, but we turned left, or gone the right way, but we went the wrong way with respect to race and equity. So that's very valuable. But let me give you a real specific question, though, about beneficiaries. Because in the book, again, you're very clear that there are 3 different types of justifications for reparation. There's a slavery period, there's a racial terrorism, a Jim Crow era, and then there's also the more recent era. But then I think when you talk about beneficiaries, you have a 2-pronged criteria. One is that the person identifies African-American. Okay, I get that. But then the other is that they be able to trace their lineage to the slave era in the United States. And I didn't understand that if any of these 3 periods can provide a justification, why would beneficiaries have to trace their lineage to slavery? And let me say, I'm good with it personally, because we can do that. Who can't, right? I'm thinking of some of my immigrant friends who can't do that. So
we're thinking of these 3, right? We think of these 3 epochs as connected. So we start, as Sandy mentioned a few moments ago, with the failure to deliver the promised 40-acre land grants. If those Black people had been given that leg up, that free equity that whites received 4-fold, right? This is land that they could have sold, they could have leased it, subdivided it, used it as collateral for loan or business, could have, gone to their bank and said, I've got this land, I want to send my kids to college so they can emerge debt-free. But most significantly, they could have passed that land on. They could have bequeathed the profits and the property itself to their heirs. And this wealth accumulation that conservatively, 45 million white Americans today are still reaping the benefits of that single government act, the Homestead Act. 45 million, that's a quarter of all white Americans, okay? This is what structural racism is. I mean, this wealth captures this cumulative intergenerational, effect of white supremacy. Whites were able to get this leg up, to hold on to it, and to bequeath it to their kids. And Black people didn't have that opportunity to do so. So we're focused on the people whose ancestors were the ones who were done wrong, by the U.S. government, and then also had to deal with nearly 100 years of legal segregation. Most of the immigrants, something like 1% of the Black immigrants in this country came to the U.S. before the Civil Rights Acts were passed. 1%. Now, many of them, as you said, from the Caribbean or from other parts of the diaspora, they absolutely have a case to make, but it's not against the U.S. government. They have a case to make against the countries that colonized and enslaved their ancestors. If they were from Trinidad, they need to talk to the UK, from Haiti to France. There is an organization called CARICOM that's focusing on this very question, looking at reparations, program for the countries in the Caribbean. Black Americans, descendants of U.S. slavery, don't have any claim to those, to that movement, nor should they. But the reverse is also true. Now, it certainly is the case that Black American descendants of U.S. slavery could make a claim on other European countries, right? But what we're focused on from Here to Equality is this very simple, very specific case of these individuals whose ancestors were brought here in chains. And that's the other thing too. We have to talk about, how people arrived. These immigrants who came to the United States in the 1960s and later did not arrive here in chains. Yeah. They made a conscious decision to come here. I always want to ask the question, so, did you not see those television programs, with those newsreels with the police and the German shepherds, when Black people were marching, and you thought, I'm going to come to the United States and somehow I'm going to live a different kind of life. Somehow the police will be able to recognize that I'm not a Black American and will treat me differently. You migrate to a country and you migrate to its history and to its obligations. And shame on you if you didn't do your homework and, look to see, why did you go to Canada? Why come here? You came here quite possibly, because of the incredible infrastructure, the, incredible, corporations, public parks, all of these things that were created on the backs of enslaved Black American descendants, Black people. And we were talking about discrimination, which continues. All of these things make life for other people so much better. So it strikes us as really kind of odd, that one, say this is the case, if one has come here seeking these advantages, and then you get here and you say, oh goodness, the police can't tell that I'm not a Native Black person, I deserve reparations. I just find that it's just odd. It's just
it sounds like you almost think it's disingenuous. In a sense.
I'm just confused about it.
I have a friend, I don't know if he's listening now, but he's fond of saying, when you talk about Black folks, you always have to distinguish. There's some of us who came by plane, others came by boat. And those are two different groups.
By boat and chains.
Right, I'm saying the boat.
Luxury cruises here.
No, I don't mean the luxury cruises. I mean the boat back in the day.
Right.
The Brook plane now.
The ship Brook. Yeah.
Okay, but let me ask you, but just to be clear, so under your proposal, immigrants who came, say, in 1965, 1970, after immigration laws changed from, Nigeria and Kenya and the Caribbean and so forth, they would not be eligible for any benefits under your proposal because they made a voluntary decision to come, and they either knew or should have known what they were getting themselves into?
No, the reason is because they are not connected to these ancestors who were denied the 40-acre land grants.
We focus heavily on the racial wealth gap as the index of the cumulative harms across all three phases. And it is only Black Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States who have that history shaping their wealth position. Individuals who have come, Black individuals who come to the United States subsequent to the 1960s, the wealth position that they bring with them into the United States is generated by a completely different set of historical processes. And so as a consequence, closing the racial wealth gap is not really pertinent to understanding whatever forms of compensation they might be due.
I mean, it's also possible that many of these individuals have married, into families of Black American descendants of slavery. And so their descendants would be eligible.
Absolutely.
Ah, yes. I hadn't thought about that. Okay. That's fine. So as I said, I'm good either way. But but let me ask you a question. So about this idea of closing the Black-white wealth gap, and this is something I do struggle with. And the question is whether that actually should be our goal of a racial justice effort. So, you're imagining a pretty drastic reallocation of resources. Let's imagine that could occur. And then a consequence of that would be that Black people have the same wealth holding that white people have, right? The same. So, but then that raises the question of whether that would be desirable, because given the growth in economic inequality in our society, frankly, America is not working for most white people either right now, right? We have a very small group of wealthy people and affluent people who are white that is working very well for, but the majority of white people even are legitimately worried about their own prospects. They're anxious about globalization, about AI and mechanization of work. Their life expectancy of some groups is declining, as we know. Many families are unable to meet very small, unexpected expenses. There's a survey that found that a shocking number of people can't meet a $400 expense. So what do you make of what of the idea that if we were to have the wealth holding of African Americans replicate the wealth holding patterns of white people, that would not be it would almost be doubling down on a form of inequality that we should be opposing?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be doubling down on inequality within the Black community, because the premise that we have is that a uniform allocation would be made to all Black Americans. And given the distribution of wealth in the Black American community at the present moment, an additional $280,000 or so per person would actually go a long way towards leveling the degree of inequality within the Black community.
Well, I don't understand that though. So wouldn't it be the case that
so much so? Well, let me tell you. Here's the measure that we use: the ratio of the median to the mean. The median to the mean, and that ratio would go up from 0.13 to approximately 0.87. And that would represent a dramatic compression in the amount of wealth that is held by all Black Americans. Now, if you're talking about the distribution of wealth among white Americans, that's a different issue, because that's extremely skewed also in the present moment. And it would not be improved by an allocation of resources to Black Americans. However, I'm an ardent advocate of other policies that would be universally applied in the United States that I hope would have some sort of effect that would be beneficial on the general degree of inequality in America. And with respect to wealth inequality, you probably know that I've been one of the advocates of what's called the baby bonds proposal, which is the provision of an endowment to each newborn infant all newborn infants in the United States, that's calibrated on the basis of the wealth position of their parents. But this is very different from addressing the racial wealth differential in the United States, where at all stages of the income distribution, whites have significantly more. So for example, 25% of white households in the United States have a net worth in excess of $1 million. It's only true for about 4% of Black households. And if you go to the bottom end of the income distribution, the bottom 20% of white Americans, the poorest white Americans, they actually have a median wealth, a median net worth that is larger than the median net worth for all Black Americans taken together. And so, we think that there's a very different issue that you have to address that's associated with the racial wealth difference. If you want to be concerned about the other problems, the general level of inequality and wealth in the United States, then develop another set of policies. And I've actually recommended one.
No, I know that. Again, we could have another conversation about the baby bonds, which is I think is a great one. But I do wonder, and I understand that's a good point about the narrowing of the economic disparities among African Americans. But did you consider making these? And this is hard to say because I would want to check, and we would put it to good use. But did you think about making the program means tested so that the most disadvantaged people get the most, and people above some threshold get little, if anything?
So it's not a poverty program. That's not what this is about. This is about a debt that is owed by the US government that is 156 years overdue, and it should be paid. When Germany was paying reparations to Holocaust victims, they didn't say, oh, this person's, a millionaire, we're not going to give them anything. Mm-hmm. The money was given to everyone who was affected by the Holocaust. When Japanese Americans were, wrongfully incarcerated basically in the United States during World War II, and in 1988, finally received reparations. This was direct payments, and they were uniform. They didn't say, oh, this person was only incarcerated for 2 years. They'll get less. Or this person was incarcerated in a camp that was a little more Tony, a little less rugged. We'll give them less. The payments were uniform because the debt was owed to all of the people who had been wrongfully incarcerated. Mm-hmm. Why is it when we're talking about Black American descendants of US slavery that we bring up these questions of means test? I'm just kind of curious to know where that's coming from.
Well, where it's coming from for me is that I'll just tell you, we have there's an extraordinary bifurcation among African Americans in terms of their economic prospects. And the ones who often are at the top, as you all know, are the people whose ancestors weren't here during the period of enslavement. And a lot of
they wouldn't be eligible for reparations.
I understand. I understand. They've done very well, but there also is a the problem seemed to be there's a if you look around at places like Stanford or Duke or all these other places, and you look at the Black kids who are there, it's not a cross section of the Black population. Most of the Black students who are at these places are the children of the most privileged Black people in the country. And one might look and say, at the margin, is it more important to make the life better of some of the most privileged Black people in the country, or is it more important to make the life better of some of the more disadvantaged Black people in the country? And
I think a transfer of $280,000 per person will certainly alter the lives of the least privileged Black Americans. One of the issues
agree.
is, of course, that the notion that there are privileged Black Americans is problematic, although it's clear that there are Black Americans who have more resources than other Black Americans. But if you look at the evidence on the relationship between educational attainment and discrimination, we have strong evidence that the discriminatory differentials actually rise as Blacks become better educated. And so there's still penalties that you're incurring all along the income distribution if you're Black, and all along the wealth distribution. Now, there may be some people like an Oprah Winfrey who receives reparations and says, well, I really don't need this. They can put it back into the pot so it can be given to somebody else. But
it shouldn't be denied them.
They have a right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me shift away from the material. So, it's certainly the case, right? As you've demonstrated, that part of persistent racial, subjugation, inequality has to do with economic resources, right? And that's a big part of the story. But you could also look at American society, and if you say, well, why are things not better now? Part of it also has to do with the culture. And in particular, American culture and the views of African Americans, perceptions of African Americans, assumptions about African Americans, and that's what allows us to kind of, as a society, make the wrong turn when we come to these forks in the road. So would a reparations problem do something or not to change the sort of currents within American culture that contribute to race-based disadvantage?
So, one of the things that, certainly the events of January 6th made crystal clear to anyone who was watching is the effects, the continued effects of the power of the Confederacy. I coined another term, deconfederatization, to talk about this process that should have happened and still could happen in the U.S., where we kind of decommission, all of these Confederate symbols, these figures. When you think about what happened in Germany, there was a very focused denazification project. And, the removal of statues, the removal of propaganda, some of these materials, these objects were placed in museums. Some of them are, under lock and key, in various cities, but they are not venerated. They are not, they're not flying, at state capitals. Like our Confederate flags are.
There's no building named after Goebbels.
Yes, exactly. Or Hitler. And then programs are put in place to cause the community to remember what happened. First of all, to interrogate their history, to do that research. That's not a perfect process by any means. And I'm sure, if you talk to anyone, who was in Germany, they would say there's a lot of work to be done, but there is much to recommend there. And we haven't done that work. We have not. I have one of my college roommates who's a Black woman who lived in Houston, went to Robert E. Lee High School. And she talked about what a horror that was. The band wore Confederate gray, and they sang Dixie. And there were Confederate flags all over the high school. This is the kind of, atrocity that we have allowed to continue in this country. So, one of the things that we would hope to see with the reparations program is a robust education program that would not only include curriculum instruction for grade schools and colleges and universities, but that for at least 3 generations, we would, be talking about, formally having these conversations in colleges and universities, so that we don't forget the past, so that we don't find ourselves in this same place, down the road.
Okay, no, that's great. So you see this as a, while you're focused on the cash or economic side, you see this as also the acknowledgement process involving education that
Yes.
would actually lead to cultural change in the broader society.
Yes.
So African Americans are not viewed as we have historically been viewed.
Yeah, I want to talk about the fact that there was such a component that
Right,
was
so
intended for the Japanese American case, but
you know, and the idea there was that they would, you know, have museum exhibitions, grade schools, curriculum would be created, plays would be commissioned, poems, musicals. But the budget for the education piece was gutted by 90% by Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done some informal surveys to ask people what they knew about what was happening, you know, in the 1980s, and almost to a person, if they did not grow up in California or possibly Oregon and maybe Washington State, they knew very little about those programs. There were some PSAs that took place. I grew up in Texas, and I'm here to tell you, there was no conversation about Japanese Americans being interned during World War II. Nor were there any conversation about Japanese redress in 1988. So education is really important. I mean, this is one of the things that the Jewish community has, you know, worked really hard. Lest we forget, I think is the motto of the Holocaust Museum, and, you know, programs that continue. We just had a day of remembrance this month, actually, both for the Holocaust and for Japanese Americans who were interned. It's that kind of effort that helps all of us kind of take a step back and say, what is that about? You know, but to make space for it.
Yeah, so that on the topic of education, since we're at universities, what should and can universities do? I mean, I know many universities have historic roles directly connected to slavery, but what should they do now? How should we think about their responsibilities? What should we be trying to hold them accountable for?
well, as you mentioned, Rick, perhaps the most prestigious universities in the eastern part of the United States all have deep connections to slavery and the slave trade. And I guess we learned fairly recently in the process of writing our book that the biological sciences program at the University of California at Berkeley was started by two Southern slaveholders from South Carolina who were on the run from the Union Army.
You mentioned that, yeah. that actually caught me, yeah.
Who brought their enslaved Black people with them
to California. Yeah. So yes, I mean, there's a tremendous number of our institutions, our most prestigious institutions, that have a history of complicity. And we thought, and Kirsten probably will comment on this in greater detail than I'm able to, but we thought initially that it would be the colleges and universities that would take the lead in petitioning and lobbying Congress for reparations, precisely because of their history of complicity and an attempt to try to engage in some form of atonement. But that clearly hasn't happened. Most of what colleges and universities have done is throw some scholarships at the problem or build a memorial to the persons who worked on their campus who were enslaved. But there really hasn't been a substantive act of the sort that says we need to contribute to a movement to produce a comprehensive reparations program at the national level.
Yeah. So let me just ask. So what I mean, this is a pressing question, because these universities you refer to, the elite universities, they are wealthier now than ever in the history of our nation, right? I mean, the billions and billions and billions of dollars in endowments, alumni networks that span the world. They're more influential than they've ever been. Yet, as you say, they've only engaged in very minimal efforts to play any role. What more should we be asking of them or demanding of them, maybe?
I think they should lead the charge. You know, lead the charge for a national program of reparations for Black Americans of U.S. slavery. You know, put that incredible muscle, put that intellectual, fervor to work, lobbying and petitioning Congress for reparations. You know, they could fund a national or an international lobbying program. They could, talk about their own complicity and what they're going to do about it. put your money where your mouth is. I mean, we also talk about, these institutions doing some house cleaning, right? So who are the thought leaders that these individual departments, look to? Who's getting hired? I mean, we all know about, we talk about who are your administrators? How about that? We all talk about, we know about sundown towns. These are places where Black people were permitted to work, but not allowed to, to be found in those places after sunset. Denison, Texas, which is near where I grew up, had a billboard that I remember seeing, end, don't let the sun set on you in Denison, Texas. I mean, I remember that from childhood. But there are sundown departments in universities and colleges that have never had a tenured Black faculty member.
Or a Black faculty member.
Period. There's a lot of work that can be done. When you look around and see, we're saying one thing, but doing another. And, using these incredible, resources that we have to turn the lens on ourselves and not just study the problem. Goodness knows we're good at that. But what are we going to do? And it's interesting, we were, I won't name the university that had asked Sandy specifically to help them talk about, how to make their faculty more diverse. And he said, well, you just cut off their funding until they do so.
That's right, that will do it.
And the room got quiet. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess that would work.
That's what if you were really serious about it, you can say that.
It can be done.
Right.
The question is, do you really want it to happen?
Yeah. So the one, okay, so I want to come back to universities in a minute, but so what about corporations? And then I know you talk in the book about you don't want to primarily hold individual institutions accountable and have them pay. You think there should be a government program at the federal level. But, we also have these private companies or, publicly owned companies now, Google and Facebook and Amazon. And, these companies are, maybe larger than, any corporate entities in the past. The founders of these companies have untold riches. Again, we have people now who are not only billionaires, but have 20, 30, 50, $100 billion or more. Should we be expecting that those companies and those founders, that they play any special role in this process?
So we don't focus on individual guilt at all, as you said. But certainly if these individuals want to support the reparations cause, then I think that would be terrific. There are a number of projects that we're hearing about every day that certainly will, probably engender some goodwill, but they don't, because they're so specific, they're not going to bring about the elimination of the racial wealth gap. And that is what we are really, keen on. If they were to put their own resources to work, to make this happen, if they were to say, we're not going to support a presidential candidate who doesn't, advocate for this, put ads in the paper, just as David Horowitz placed ads in college and university newspapers saying reparations was a terrible thing, they could say this must happen immediately. And we're going to do everything we can to make that happen. They have influence, people listen to them. But we do still think that the culpable party is the U.S. government, but there's a lot that corporations and all of us can do to help this become a reality.
Yeah, and related to that, the corporations have an excuse, which is, I think is potentially a valid excuse, that no matter what they did that was immoral, it was entirely legal. And so the institution that's responsible for the legality of their actions is the institution that must pay the bill.
Okay. And we have just a few minutes left. We have a number of questions where people want to know what can they do individually. Whether you're student, faculty, staff, community member, people want to know how to take action in their own lives. What are your top recommendations?
So Durham, North Carolina City Council, where we live, unanimously passed a resolution advocating for a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. One could get a copy of that document. scratch out Durham, North Carolina, put your own city in there, put your own name, your family's name, your ultimate Frisbee group, your artisanal beer drinking group, you know, your crafts beer group, and send that on to Congress. You know, I think that there's a lot that we as individuals can do. In addition to getting our own households in order, we can advocate for reparations. Now, importantly, Durham, North Carolina's resolution has three very important tenets in it, principles. First of all, it identifies the eligible recipients as Black American descendants of U.S. slavery and individuals who have self-identified as Black, African American, Negro, or Afro-American at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations committee or the initiation of a reparations program.
I think they might have read that in a book that I know.
Yes, perhaps. But they also
we plead culpability.
Yes, yes.
We plead culpability.
We were delighted to receive that call. But the resolution also specifies that direct payments should be made to the eligible recipients and that the elimination of the racial wealth gap is the target. Mm-hmm. It also talks about some questions about HR 40, which is a whole other conversation we could have. This is legislation that's been a placeholder for 30 years, but is woefully inadequate. And we do not believe it will deliver true reparations and needs to be either dramatically revised or scrapped altogether, and we start anew with legislation that will be effective.
And there's one more important point about that resolution, which is the Durham City Council does not claim that whatever local actions are being taken to reverse harms, they don't call that reparations.
Yes.
They say that they're racial equity initiatives. And we think that that language is far more suitable for talking about what you're doing at the local level. But it was very exciting to see them say they were going to sign on to the national program. And we'd love to see other communities do the same thing.
I mean, we view this as a sacred mission, and we think that that term reparations should be reserved for programs that are focused on eliminating the racial wealth gap. All these other programs are important, and they're initiatives that individuals and communities and college universities want to get behind. And we understand that it's something they can control, something that's theirs, but it doesn't take the place of reparations. But we want both and, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wish we had more time, but we are out of time, and I'm getting the figurative, pull. The hook is pulling me off the stage. So let me just thank both.
The Apollo Theater hook.
Yes, this is a wonderful conversation, and again, I take it back to at least our first conversation about this some years ago, and I cannot overstate not only how overjoyed I am, but how enthusiastic our entire family is that you have brought this project to fruition, and we want to journey with you on this road and help however we can. So thank you for sharing these ideas with this audience. And now I will turn it over to Alex. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you yet again to all of those working hard behind the scenes to make this event happen, and to all the guests who tuned in today. Most thanks and appreciation to Professor Darity and Kristen Mullen for this enlightening conversation and for forwarding this always timely and essential issue with very concrete analyses and proposals. And thank you, Professor Rick Banks, for moderating an exciting and thought-provoking conversation. You can learn more about this work by reading From Here to Equality via UNC Press. There it is.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
You.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.